Hello, everybody. Welcome to week 6 of the course. Start off with an announcement. In case you guys didn't notice, I posted participation grades for the first 5 weeks. Basic grading standard. If you responded to the question in a thoughtful way, meaning like it was obvious that you had read it and sort of thought about the particular issues that are brought up and maybe some of the challenges with those issues, wrote a thoughtful response, then read your classmates' responses, and then responded once again in a thoughtful way. A point that I made is, just echoing something somebody says is probably not. I mean, that's fine to do if you want to do that, but that's not really what I'm looking for when I say a thoughtful response. I'm thinking about, hey, that's a great point. Did you think about this particular point? And something like 3 or 4 sentences at least, right? Showing that you're really trying to engage with what the other person said. So yeah, if you do that, you get a perfect score. If you just post, your post and don't respond, I'm going to take points off. Then, of course, if you don't post anything, you won't get a passing grade for that week. So, if anybody has any questions on that, feel free to shoot me an email. Also, if you for some reason weren't able to participate that week and you want to go back and add something, that's fine. Let me know that you did that, and I'll give you some credit for that week. It won't be full credit, but it'll be better than what it currently is. Okay, so this week we're talking about public opinion and the media and how those inform U.S. government. But before I get into that, I want to look a little bit back to last week, where we were looking at American political culture. And both of the articles that we read, the one by David Brooks, who, if you guys don't know, he's a political columnist for the New York Times. He writes an op-ed article, I think, twice a week for the New York Times. Pretty good. He's a pretty good writer. So, if you're interested in the article that we read, and you thought that was interesting, you may want to follow his column on the New York Times. I believe you can access it for free. And he was talking about the distinction between red and blue America. And then we read an article by Glenn Loury talking about the democratic idea and the divided society, where he was talking about America being divided by race. So the question becomes, the American ideals, going back to the founding of the country, or sort of we the people, right? Government by the people. But of course the challenge becomes, or at least the question arises, when you have so many divisions in society, can you really make a statement like we the people? When it seems like the people believe very different things and have very different cultures, very different values. So the question is really how much of a challenge does that present to sort of American democracy? And you go back and you think about sort of the popular ideals, because I do think, and Loury talks about the democratic ideal, and I think when you're talking about divisions in society, it's important to go back to the fundamental aspects of U.S. government. So, one of the first things Thomas Jefferson says is you have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? So those are the 3 fundamental rights. And this last one, or the last 2 actually, liberty and the pursuit of happiness, by enshrining those rights in the Declaration of Independence and later in the Constitution, essentially what you've done by giving people the liberty to pursue what makes them happy, or to pursue what they believe is the good life, right? And when you're living in a society that has so many different cultures, so many different races, so many different religions, you're going to have different opinions on what it means to live the good life, right? So that's going to divide people in a very substantive way. Some people, as Brooks was talking about, some people value the community more, whereas in the blue areas he was talking about, people seem to be more individualistic. But that's one of the fundamental tenets of our democratic form of government, is that people have the right. Literally, that's the fundamental right, is the right to choose what you believe is the conception of public good. So even ironically, by providing that one particular right, or enshrining that right, it's almost like we're fated in a lot of ways, and we have the right to be different, right? We have the right to be divided. And that's where that phrase, if you look on the back of your money, there's a Latin phrase that says "e pluribus unum," and that means out of the many, one. So the question is, where do we come together as the one? So before we talk about that, I just want to run through the Brooks and Lowry articles a little bit. I'm not going to rehash it because you guys have read it and we've discussed it. Brooks essentially divides, he says he divides the country into two areas, right? The red areas and the blue areas. And he became interested in this because he lives in a blue area. He lives just outside of Washington, D.C. in Montgomery County, Maryland, which is very urban. It's very educated, very liberal. And he says, but just a short drive from Montgomery County, Maryland, is rural Pennsylvania. And in rural Pennsylvania, Franklin County, I believe, it's very red. It's almost like a different world, right, than the world that he lives in, where people are much more religious, people are much more conservative. The incomes are not as high. They place a great value on community. So it seems like there's this great cultural divide. I mean, it's almost like there are two countries, according to Brooks, living in one, who have radically different values, right? So he tries to think about, what are some popular explanations for first, why this division happened, besides the thing that I pointed out, the inevitability of things dividing under the Constitution. The first thing he looks at is the economic explanation, which essentially says that after the industrial age ended, and with NAFTA, all the manufacturing jobs were leaving the country. Information age came in, and during the information age, when that came in, the people who were more educated had the jobs. Therefore, they were making more money, and the people who were living in the rural areas where the manufacturing jobs were had lost their jobs, and their income had gone down. So essentially he defined it as a distinction between the haves, who he believed in the blue areas, were in the blue areas, and the have-nots, who seemed to be in the red areas. So to test this theory out, he started interviewing people in the red areas. And he said, do you believe that there's this great class conflict in the United States between the people who live in the urban areas and the people who live in the poor area, or the rural areas? And he said the people looked at him like he had a third eye, right? They didn't quite understand. So he rephrased the question by saying, do you believe that this is a country that's defined by the haves and the have-nots? And in this case, people pretty readily said, yes, we do believe that. But the ironic thing was that the people in the red, supposedly the poor areas, actually considered themselves almost overwhelmingly to be part of the haves and not the have-nots, right? And the reason for that is, even though there's this economic disparity between salaries, the cost of living is actually much lower in the red areas. So your money goes a lot farther, right? So they didn't really have the impression that there was this distinction between have and have-nots. So Brooks kind of dismisses that as a possible explanation. The second things he looks at are religion and sort of moral background, right? And he cites, how much of the red areas are more traditionally religious, mostly Christian, whereas the blue areas are much more secular. They're agnostic, atheist. They may have some sort of spiritual connection, but they're not as associated with organized religion. But he said, the problem with that was it appears that they're the same moral shortcomings that people have in the areas that are not as religious exist in the community, in the rural communities. So once again, he said, if it's the case that the red areas are more religious, shouldn't it be the case that they're more moral? And that is not the case. And furthermore, he found that the people who were religious in the red areas, even though they had their beliefs, they didn't try to go on some great crusade, because they didn't judge people in their communities as much, because they knew that it was important that they function as a community, and gossiping or judging somebody else could damage the bonds of that community. So once again, he said, this is not a good divide. So the divide he actually settles on is something called, I think he calls it the ego divide, where he says it's the conception of the self that is different between red and blue. In blue, the conception of the self is very large. it's all about individual gain. It's about what can I do to get ahead. Whereas in the red areas, it's much more community focused, right? So people are more interested with fitting in. He talked about people wearing sort of colorless clothes or driving um, modest cars versus driving a Lexus or dressing in a flashy way, right? And he said, if he had to point to one distinction that he got to between the red and the blue areas, that was it, the conception of the self. Uh, red areas, the self is small. Large areas, the self is big. So he finally concludes by saying, look, it's not that we live in this great culturally divided society. He said it's more, he calls it a cafeteria nation. And he said, remember when you were in high school, grade school, whatever, in the cafeteria, how you had all the different groups. You had the jocks over here, you had the nerds over here, you had the drama folks over here, all these different groups which people had self-selected into, right? And he said that's the great thing about America. It is a cafeteria nation, and the great thing is we have the freedom that was enshrined in this thing about the pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that enables us to choose which group in the cafeteria that we actually want to belong to. So according to Brooks, that's the thing that actually unifies us. And of course, some of you in your discussion pointed out some problems with this, saying that this seems very stereotypical, and it is. Anytime you try to generalize an entire area, 30,000 people or whatever, in the case with smaller towns, we're up to millions of people in the blue areas. You're doing some serious stereotyping if you're lumping them all into one category, right? So yeah, it is certainly stereotypical, and you can't make generalizations at that level. But there probably is something to what Brooks is saying there. And then we looked at Glenn Loury, who is an economist at Brown University, and his discussion of race as a fault line in American society. And he goes back to the great sort of discriminations that have happened against African Americans throughout American history. Of course, starting with slavery and continuing on even after slavery was abolished. Equality, has been a long march towards progress. It didn't happen overnight. Obviously, when the slaves were freed, it took another 100 years before the Civil Rights Movement, and the Jim Crow laws were in effect in between there. So it's been a systematic discrimination throughout most of American history towards African Americans. So he says, rightly with Martin Luther King, enshrined in your ideals, you have this, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, and it has not been the case, in American history that people are created equal. Of course, that's an interesting question worth pondering, right? How are people equal? People have different intelligence levels, people have different income levels, people have different athletic abilities. People's abilities are not equal, right? But people are equal in that they deserve equal rights, right? So they should all have the protections that are offered by the Constitution and equal opportunity, right? Those are the two ways in which all men are created equal, especially under U.S. law, right? That's how equality is defined: equal rights, equal opportunity. So even though there's been this long progress towards reaching some sort of equality for African Americans, still not equal opportunity, in the history of the United States. So then he starts trying to look at some particular solutions, right? But first he makes sort of this economic argument showing that people's skill level, he makes the argument that people's skill level is tied into their context and their social background, which is essentially a way of arguing that, if you're coming from a more poor area, a less educated area, you're not going to have the same skills and the same opportunities that people who come from a wealthier lifestyle, more privileged lifestyle come from. And then tying that into, this history tradition of inequality for African Americans, which is going to lead to the idea that African Americans, because they haven't had the same privilege and resources that whites have, don't have the same opportunities to develop the skills. So this notion of the American dream, people can pull themselves up by their bootstraps, is very limited in a lot of ways, right? It's limited by where you come from, who your parents are, what community you grow up in. Can you overcome those things? Sure, you can, but it's extremely difficult in a lot of situations. So he starts looking at this notion of affirmative action and whether affirmative action is a good solution to this particular problem of racial inequality. And he concludes that affirmative action is not a good solution to racial inequality. And he says this for a couple of reasons. He says, first, affirmative action actually reinforces the stereotype that African Americans are not as talented as white Americans, right? Because if you're in a situation where you're giving African Americans some sort of privilege, based on this inequality, then people, both themselves and the other people, the whites or other people in the organization, in the school, whatever, are going to recognize that there's this type of double standard there, right? So, well, sure, they got accepted into school, they got accepted in the university, but they're not really as good as me because this affirmative action thing says that people with lower standards can actually be admitted, should actually be admitted. So it reinforces a cultural stereotype that African Americans are not, as talented or as intelligent, whatever, as white Americans, Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans, whatever. So that's one thing he says. The other thing that he says is it actually reinforces this notion that it cuts off the incentive for African Americans to try to improve themselves. Because if they can get in, without pushing themselves to their complete limit, then why push yourself? If you're going to be accepted into a university or get a job, when you don't have to push yourself as hard as you want to, then why would you? So he says it sort of cuts off the incentive. And the final thing he says is that affirmative action, may help some people in society, but it's not going to help the people who need it the most. And he calls them the urban poor, the people who are really poverty-stricken and have no chance of getting out of the slums or going to a university or getting a good job or anything like that, because their living conditions are so poor that it's like another galaxy going to a college, right? I mean, it may happen in the rarest of occasions, but not very often. And affirmative action, he says, it's just simply not relevant to those particular people. So he says that there does need to be some sort of attention given at the government level to sort of trying to balance out these racial inequalities. But he says rather than creating sort of this system that has double standards, why not actually go into these communities and try to help these people increase their competencies, rather than creating sort of this deficit model where you say that you're going to accept people, even if their skill levels are not up to the same measure. So that's where Lowry comes down, and ultimately he says, look, we got to get beyond race, because race is one very small part of this. I mean, there's race, there's income, there's culture, there's education, there's family structure, there's all these problems that are associated with these inequalities. And if we only try to address it by race, we're only taking one very small piece of the puzzle. So we have to look at it more from a human perspective rather than from a racial perspective. So those are the two articles from last week. I thought you guys did a really good job in the discussions. As I said, some people pointed out, it seemed very stereotypical, which I think was certainly good. A lot of people said, look, yeah, the country is divided, right? I mean, these things are obviously true. But the point that I try to make is that, our government is set up in such a way as to promote these divisions, to promote these divisions. In fact, it's one of the great strengths of our system. The question becomes, what do we have to be unified in to actually function as a society and move forward? And that's the real question, right? I mean, Does it matter whether we have different different cultural beliefs? No, I mean, probably not, right? As long as we can get behind things like the Bill of Rights, equal rights, equal opportunities, and the rule of law, and promoting sort of the American dream ideal, right? That each people do have a shot, right? Social mobility, things like that. These sort of overarching ideals. So those are the things that we have to be unified on. We don't have to be unified on we all have the same political beliefs. The founders thought that that was a mistaken ideal, right? I mean, it actually we balance each other out because nobody's completely right. So it's sort of the wisdom of the masses in that way, and each other side keeps or all the sides sort of work to keep each other in check, right? Okay, so that was last week. So this week we're looking at public opinion and the media. So the first article, which is the Monica Lewinsky article, asks the question: how much of public opinion is shaped by what you hear in the media, or is it actually shaped by the political substance, meaning like the conditions of the economy, how stable the government is, how effective the government is, things like that. So we often always hear that the media plays a great role in influencing public opinion, and it does. But the Lewinsky article presents sort of an interesting counter position to that. And the second article by James Fallows is Why Americans Hate the Media, right? And he points out that what the people find interesting and what the journalists find interesting are often two different things, right? So it's interesting to see where they fall versus the perspective that most citizens actually bring. And essentially he says that citizens are interested in the what, and the journalists are interested in the political game, right? How things get done. So yeah, really interesting articles. I think you guys will enjoy those. We're going to have new discussion groups this week, so I'm going to post those when I post the questions on Wednesday. And just so you guys know, I always post the discussion question on Wednesday. Try to do it Wednesday morning. Sometimes it might be a Wednesday afternoon. But anyway, so look for those new discussion groups. I'll post them. I'll make an announcement that I've posted new discussion groups. I want you guys to do your discussions in those groups. And yeah, discussion's up on Wednesday. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email. I hope you have a great week.